All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at social norms. And, for you, our listener, the philosopher out there, well, we know you love to get into those deep questions. So we're not going to just scratch the surface here. We're going all the way down into the philosophical core of these really interesting phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. Social norms. I mean, these are those often unspoken rules that, well, they kind of shape how we act in groups and societies, right? And they're this rich area of study across a whole bunch of different fields.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you've got anthropologists looking at all the different ways norms play out in different cultures, and sociologists, well, they're studying how norms function in society. And then you've got economists, right, who are analyzing how norms influence our choices. And legal theorists, well, they're thinking about how norms relate to actual laws.
Right, exactly. And, while all of those fields definitely offer valuable perspectives, our real focus today is on the philosophical understanding of these norms. We want to understand how norms and conventions, these things, they kind of grow organically from the interactions between people.
Yeah.
We're talking less about like rules being imposed from above and more about how these patterns emerge, from the bottom up.
Exactly. It's like, how do these things just appear?
Right. And central to this whole philosophical perspective are concepts like expectations. Like, what do we expect other people to do? And then there's what we believe others understand. And of course, the knowledge we share as a group. Grasping these elements, that's what's key to distinguishing genuine social norms from just plain old conventions like table manners, right?
Yeah. All right, there's a difference between which fork you use and, telling the truth.
Right, exactly. The moral weight is different. And then there are also those descriptive norms, which are basically just, observations of common behavior, but they don't have that added layer of expectation or like a should.
Okay, so let's start with a really basic question. How do we even begin to get a handle on what social norms actually are? One analogy that I think might resonate, especially for a philosopher, is thinking of social norms as a kind of grammar for how we interact socially.
Yeah, I like that. That's insightful. Because, grammar kind of tells us what's okay to say and what's not okay to say in a particular language. And it's often not even explicitly taught, it's just kind of there. And in a similar way, social norms, well, they define the boundaries of acceptable behavior in our interactions. And what's really interesting, just like with grammar, is that these norms often just pop up spontaneously through our repeated interactions with each other. There's no central authority dictating them. It's not like there's a big book of social norms that everyone gets handed at birth.
Yeah, true. But then how do we actually identify a social norm? Is it just about seeing what people consistently do, like those recurring patterns of behavior? Or is it something deeper, something about what people believe and expect about how others should act?
Oh, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
If you try to define norms purely based on behavior, you run into a wall pretty quickly because it gets hard to tell the difference between a social norm and just a plain habit. Think about brushing your teeth. Most of us do it every day, multiple times a day. But, that doesn't necessarily mean we all believe we have to do it because everyone else expects us to, right?
Yeah, it could just be a personal thing.
Exactly. It might just be routine. And the crucial element, that sense of shared expectation and, often a sense of should, that's missing.
Right. So just spotting a trend, that's not enough. We've got to look at the whole web of beliefs and expectations that lie beneath. Now, there were these early theories called functionalist accounts that really focused on the why of social norms. They argued that norms, they exist for a reason. They serve some beneficial purpose for society. What's the gist there?
Well, the main idea behind functionalism is that norms, they somehow contribute to making society work better, to the overall well-being of the group. Some people said they make things more efficient, they prevent markets from collapsing, they smooth out those social interactions. Others focused on their role in solving those tricky collective action problems where everyone acting in their own self-interest can lead to a bad outcome for everybody. And then there's this idea of accountability. Norms provide a framework for rewards and punishments. They attach meaning to certain actions. So they reinforce the group's identity.
Okay, so we have some pretty concrete examples of these functionalist explanations, right? There's Ekerloff's analysis of land systems, right? What's the functional logic behind that?
Well, in that one, Akerlof, he was looking at why sharecropping was so common compared to, say, a wage system. Right. Now, you might think, well, a wage system where the landlord takes on all the risk of crops failing, that seems pretty straightforward, right? But it doesn't really motivate the workers to put in a lot of effort. Sharecropping, on the other hand, where the worker gets a share of the harvest, Well, that aligns the incentives better. So you can see it as a social norm that boosts agricultural productivity, especially in places where it's hard to keep an eye on what the workers are doing. So the function here is, getting things done more efficiently by aligning everyone's incentives.
Interesting. So something that seems less efficient on the surface can actually be more functional, right? It's
Yeah.
like it solves a specific problem.
Exactly.
Okay, what about Thiebaud and Kelly's idea? They talked about norms as a way to, like, smooth out those social interactions, to
Yeah.
avoid constant negotiation.
Yeah, that's a good one. They basically said that norms can save us from all those costly back and forths, Like, imagine you and I are always trying to get our way. They use the example of this game, the battle of the sexes. Instead of constantly fighting for what we each want, we might just adopt a norm, like taking turns. You get your way one time, I get mine the next. That norm, it just pops up as a way to cut down on the effort we have to spend bargaining and to avoid all the potential conflict that comes with it. And so we end up with a stable, predictable pattern of interaction. So the function is to cut down on all that social influence back and forth, to minimize the costs.
So it's like a pre-commitment, to avoid all that friction. Makes sense.
Right.
And then there's Oman Margalit. She brought game theory into the mix, suggesting that norms emerge to solve those classic collective action dilemmas. The prisoner's dilemma is the famous one. What's the functional argument there?
Well, she argues that norms, especially those that come with potential punishments for people who break them, they can actually transform situations like the prisoner's dilemma, where the individually rational choice ends up being bad for everyone. So the norm provides a way to resist that temptation to defect, to screw the other person over, and it leads to a more efficient outcome. So we call that Pareto efficiency, where nobody can be made better off without making someone else worse off. So, the function here is solving collective action problems.
Okay, and Coleman, he focused on how norms, well, they kind of step in to regulate those externalities. Those are like the spillover effects of our actions,
Yeah.
right? The things that affect others, but, we don't bear the cost of directly.
Right, exactly. So Coleman argued that when someone does something that has a negative impact on other people, but there's no direct consequence for that person, a norm can emerge to, internalize those externalities. So by introducing punishments for the harmful behavior and maybe even rewards for good behavior, the norm encourages people to think about the wider social impact of their actions.
Got it. So it's all about managing those negative byproducts of what people do.
Right.
And then finally, there's Brennan and his colleagues. They were really interested in the whole accountability function of norms, like how norms help us hold each other to certain standards.
Yeah, their main point was that norms, by setting up these clear expectations of compliance, they give us a basis for holding each other accountable, And that accountability, well, it gives those actions social meaning. It contributes to a sense of shared identity within the group. So in other words, the function is to create meaning and identity through this shared expectation that we're all going to stick to the rules.
Okay, so these functionalist accounts, they paint a pretty convincing picture of norms as like these really useful societal tools, right?
Mm-hmm.
But from a philosophical point of view, there have been some pretty strong criticisms of this perspective. What are some of the main objections?
Well, one big critique is that functionalist explanations, they can often end up sounding like, after the fact justifications. Just because we can point to some positive outcome of a norm, that doesn't necessarily mean that's why it came about in the first place. So it raises these questions about causality, Are we just finding convenient stories to explain why things are the way they are? And then there's the issue of those harmful or inefficient norms, like discriminatory practices. If norms are all about maximizing social welfare, then how come these bad norms stick around? And some philosophers argue that functionalism, it can be a little too rigid, It doesn't really explain how norms change and adapt as circumstances change.
Right. Those are some really sharp points. So if it's not all about the function a norm serves, what other perspectives do philosophers offer? Some of them focus on how norms emerge, from the ground up, like from interactions between individuals. Schelling's work on how order just kind of emerges, that comes to mind. What's the philosophical importance of this shift in focus?
Well, the big deal about focusing on emergence is that it changes the explanation from this top-down view where, norms exist because they serve a purpose to a bottom-up view where norms are kind of like the unintended consequences of all those little interactions between individuals. So Schelling's work, it shows how order, including norms, can just sort of appear spontaneously from the actions of lots of individuals, even without anyone consciously designing it. And this view, it really emphasizes the role of individual agency and the dynamics of how we interact in shaping the norms we see. And cooperation, well, that becomes central. Philosophers are really interested in how norms of honesty, loyalty, reciprocity, promise keeping, how do these things arise and maintain social order?
Yeah, and there's this idea that cooperative norms, they're more likely to pop up in close-knit groups, those with lots of repeated interactions, right? And this is often associated with Hardin. How does that fit with philosophical ideas about cooperation?
Well, philosophically, the idea that repeated interactions, they breed cooperation, it aligns with all these ideas about reciprocity and how trust develops. In smaller groups, especially those that are pretty stable, people have more chances to get to know each other, to figure out who's reliable and who's not. And then there's evolutionary game theory, specifically the study of repeated games. That gives us a formal way to understand how cooperative strategies can actually evolve over time, how they become stable through mechanisms like reciprocal altruism, where, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And Alexander, he really emphasized that the earliest cooperative norms, they have to be simple. The more complex and demanding norms, well, they're probably less likely to get off the ground.
So it's like norms start small, then they spread out to larger populations. But then again, they can also disappear, sometimes pretty suddenly. Philosophically, what does this tell us about the nature of norms?
It really highlights how dynamic they are, and sometimes how fragile. Like, think about how quickly attitudes have shifted towards things like smoking in public or using gendered language. Those changes show us that norms aren't set in stone. And from a philosophical standpoint, it raises questions about what drives those changes, right? What are the forces that lead to norms changing? Is it shifting beliefs? Is it changes in social influence? Or is it like new norms competing with the old ones? And Behaviour makes this point that just because a norm is inefficient, that doesn't mean it's going to die out. Like, we still have crime and corruption, right? Those things are clearly not good for society. So there must be factors beyond just pure utility that keep norms around. And Muldoon argues that it's actually pretty hard to intentionally change social norms, which suggests that they have this kind of stickiness, They can even shape how we understand our own agency, like what actions we think are possible or even desirable.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought, right?
Yep.
That norms actually shape our sense of what we can do, what we're even allowed to want.
Right.
So another key philosophical idea is this notion of norms as self-fulfilling expectations. It's a bit like, a social Schelling point where we all converge on a particular behavior because we expect everyone else to do the same. And this connects to the whole idea of conditional preferences. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, that's a good one. The idea of self-fulfilling expectations, it really highlights the power of belief in maintaining social order. Like, if we all expect everyone else to act in a certain way, we're more likely to act that way ourselves, which just reinforces the whole thing. Philosophically, conditional preferences are crucial because they suggest that our desires, our motivations, they're not fixed. They depend on the context, specifically on what we think other people are going to do and what we believe is considered acceptable behavior within the group. Seddon and Behaviour's work, they really stress this point that our preference for sticking to a social norm, well, it often depends on these expectations. Like, we might prefer to cooperate, but only if we think other people will cooperate too.
So Behaviour, she makes this distinction between empirical expectations, which are about what we predict others will actually do, and normative expectations, which are about what we believe others think we should do. And those are often backed up by, potential sanctions. Philosophically, how does this distinction help us understand why people comply with norms?
It's a really important distinction. Philosophically, it separates those predictions about what people will do from our beliefs about what's right or wrong, what's appropriate. According to Behaviour, we're most likely to follow a norm when we have both types of expectations. So not only do we expect others to follow it, but we also believe that others expect us to follow it. And that belief, it can be driven by a sense that the norm is legitimate, that it makes sense, or by the fear of getting punished if we don't. And this framework helps us understand why we sometimes conform, even when we don't personally agree with the norm, as long as those expectations are there.
Right. It helps explain the difference between genuine social norms and just, things we do habitually, like brushing our teeth. There's no shared sense of obligation there. And we saw this illustrated in that study by Turnbull on the Eintracht people, where they actually avoided behaviors that might trigger expectations of reciprocity. What's the philosophical significance of that finding?
That's a fascinating case. Philosophically, what Turnbull's study shows us is the hidden power of norms, even when they're not being actively practiced. Like, even when a norm isn't in play at that moment, the knowledge that it exists, that it could be invoked, can still influence how people act. The Eintracht, they were so keen to avoid situations where reciprocity might be expected. It shows just how strong that underlying normative pressure can be. And it shows the potential social cost of violating a norm, even one that seems dormant.
It's also interesting, philosophically speaking, how often there's this mismatch between what people expect others to do and what they themselves are willing to do. It's called pluralistic ignorance. What are the implications of this?
Oh, pluralistic ignorance. That's a tricky one. Philosophically, it reveals this potential instability in social norms. Imagine a situation where everyone secretly disagrees with a norm, but they mistakenly believe that everyone else agrees with it. Well, that norm, it's basically sitting on a powder keg. And once that shared misperception is exposed, the whole thing can collapse pretty quickly. And it also raises these really interesting questions about the relationship between individual beliefs and how groups behave, and how, having the wrong idea about what other people think can actually perpetuate norms that nobody really supports. Like, there's all these examples of people expecting others to be selfish, but then acting altruistically themselves. Or that scenario with the landlord, right? It shows how our assumptions about other people can distort our understanding of what the social norms actually are, and even our understanding of our own place within that system. And Wuthnow, he made this observation about how people often downplay their own altruistic motives, which suggests that they feel this pressure to conform to this presumed norm of self-interest, even when it doesn't actually reflect their values.
So to sum it up, from a philosophical point of view, social norms are about actions we can control, and they're supported by this really complex web of shared expectations, both those empirical expectations about what people will do and those normative expectations about what people think we should do. But they can't be reduced to simply observing behavior, and they're not just about our individual moral beliefs either.
Yeah, you nailed it. The interplay between our actions, our predictions about others' actions, and our beliefs about what others expect from us, that's the real philosophical core of what a social norm is.
Okay, so that gives us a pretty solid foundation. Now let's look at some of the early philosophical adjacent theories about norms, starting with Parsons' idea of socialization. What's the main argument there?
Parsons' central argument, well, it's that even though our actions might seem like they're driven by self-interest, they actually happen within this framework of social order, which is maintained by a shared system of values, those values that are embodied in norms. And in his view, those norms are mostly external to the individual. They're like the structure of society itself. So the philosophical puzzle he was trying to solve was this. How are these seemingly rational egoists, people who are just out for themselves, how are they motivated to follow these norms that are imposed on them from outside?
And his solution was this process of internalization through socialization, right? Where those external norms, they basically get woven into our preferences and become the drivers of our actions. How does this happen philosophically?
Well, philosophically, internalization, the way Parsons saw it, it's like this process where society's values and norms, they get transmitted to individuals. They become part of their psychological makeup through, all those interactions with important people in our lives, especially when we're kids. We learn and adopt those norms. So conforming, it's not just about external pressure anymore. It becomes an internal desire, almost like part of who we are. And feelings like guilt and shame, they act as internal sanctions when we even think about deviating from these norms that we've internalized. So if this process works, then our normative beliefs, what we believe is right or wrong, they should line up really well with our actions. And the expectations of other people become less important because the motivation to conform, well, it's coming from inside us.
But philosophically speaking, this whole socialized actor idea, it's been criticized quite a bit, hasn't it? Like, it seems to downplay the role of individual agency, of our own choices.
That's one of the main philosophical objections. Critics argue that in Parsons' theory, people are portrayed as, just passively receiving these societal norms, like they're just sponges soaking it all up. And it ignores their ability to think for themselves, to resist, even to shape those social structures. The focus on those abstract social roles and the big overarching social system, it seems to overshadow the choices and the agency of actual individuals. And that led to all these debates about how much weight you should give to the individual versus the collective in social theory.
And when we look at the evidence, some of the core predictions of this theory, well, they don't really hold up, do they? Especially the idea that norms change slowly. What are the philosophical implications of this?
Philosophically, the fact that norms often change really quickly, it challenges this idea that our values are deeply ingrained and slow to evolve. Like, if norms were so deeply embedded, we'd expect them to be much more resistant to change, right? And then there's those studies that show inconsistencies between what people say they believe and what they actually do, like those by Lapierre and Wicker. Those studies suggest that there are other things besides internalized values that influence our actions, things like situational pressures and those expectations from other people. And Warner and DeFleur found that what we believe other people expect from us, that can be a stronger predictor of our behavior than our own personal beliefs. And that further undermines this emphasis on purely internal motivations.
Which brings us back to that crucial distinction between our own private normative beliefs and our awareness of those broader societal expectations, right? Parsons' theory seems to be mostly about those personal beliefs, but it maybe overlooks the power of those societal expectations in shaping our behavior.
Exactly. That's a really important point. While Parsons' model might be helpful for understanding how we develop strong moral convictions, it's not so good at explaining all those other social norms, the ones that can emerge and change pretty quickly. The fact that we can adapt to new norms so easily when we enter different social groups suggests that learning and responding to those external expectations, well, that might be a more important mechanism for a lot of our social behavior than just internalizing values.
Okay, so let's look at a different approach. This one comes from social identity theory with Tajfel and Turner. This theory, it shifts the focus from internalized values to our sense of belonging to a group, to our social relationships as motivators. What's the core insight here?
The main idea behind social identity theory is that who we are, our sense of self, it's not just defined by our individual characteristics. It's also defined by belonging to different groups. And our membership in these groups gives us a social identity, which comes with emotions and values. And this perspective, it challenges that idea from socialized actor theory that there's this weak link between our beliefs and our actions. It argues that identifying with a group becomes a really strong motivator for acting in line with the group's norms. And a key element here is that it emphasizes the idea of choice, that we choose to identify with a particular group.
Right, so we're not just passively absorbing these identities.
Right, it's an active process.
And this act of identifying with a group, it leads to a fundamental shift in how we see ourselves and what drives us. Yeah, we start to see ourselves and other members of the group through the lens of these shared typical group characteristics. What's the philosophical significance of this whole self-categorization process?
Well, philosophically, self-categorization is really important because it shows how our identity and our motivations are, socially constructed. They come from our interactions with others. When we categorize ourselves as part of a group or individual self-perception, it gets all mixed up with the characteristics, roles, beliefs, and expected actions of that group. And it's not just about adopting external norms, it's about an internal shift in how we see ourselves and what we value. And Turner's self-categorization theory, it takes this even further. It shows how whether we're focused on our social identity or our personal identity, it depends on who we're comparing ourselves to. It emphasizes how fluid and context-dependent our self-concept is and how that influences what motivates us.
Yeah, so who we're with and what we're doing can really affect how we see ourselves.
Right.
And this group identification, it could lead to things like in-group favoritism, even actions that seem to go against our own self-interest, all for the sake of the group. But then focusing on our unique contributions, well, that strengthens our personal identity. What are the philosophical implications of this tension?
That tension between what's good for the individual and what's good for the group, it's a classic philosophical problem. Social identity theory gives us a way to understand how our commitment to a group can override those purely selfish motivations. But then in-group favoritism, it raises all these ethical questions about fairness and justice toward people outside the group. And the willingness to do things that might hurt us personally for the good of the group, it shows just how strong those social bonds are and how much our shared identity matters. It challenges those theories that say we're just rational individuals always pursuing our own self-interest. And then there's stereotyping, right? Which is basically creating this prototype of what a group member is like. And that has a cognitive role. It activates these shared scripts and schemas that tell us what's considered group behavior, and self-stereotyping, where we internalize those group attributes. That's the crucial link between identifying with the group and actually behaving in line with the group.
So this group behavior, it's characterized by things like a shared sense of who we are, cooperation, and sticking to those group norms. It's almost like we become depersonalized in a way. We take on the group's goals as our own, and that would naturally lead to more pro-social behavior within the group. What are the philosophical implications of this depersonalization?
Well, philosophically, depersonalization in this context, it doesn't mean that we lose our individuality entirely. It's more like a shift in how we define self-interest. So our own well-being becomes linked to the well-being of the group. Embracing the group's interests and goals, it can be seen as expanding our sense of self to include the collective. And that has huge implications for how we understand things like altruism and cooperation. It suggests that these behaviors can come about not just from abstract moral principles, but also from our basic need to belong, to be part of something larger than ourselves. ourselves and the value we place on those social identities. And then group-specific norms, they become like boundary markers. They define who's in and who's out. You see this in groups like the Amish or the Hasidic Jews with their distinctive practices. And then there's Hogg and Turner's idea of referent informational influence, which suggests that we conform to those in-group norms because we trust and identify with other members of the group.
So group norms, they do double duty. They minimize differences within the group and maximize differences with other groups. And if anyone deviates from those norms, well, that can be seen as a threat to the legitimacy of the group, which leads to pressure to conform and even to policing those who step out of line. The classic example of the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, with their different hairstyles, that perfectly illustrates this link between norms and group membership.
Absolutely. You know, the Roundheads' short hair and the Cavaliers' long hair, they weren't just fashion choices. They were powerful symbols of group identity and adherence to different norms and values. It shows how even something as seemingly trivial as hair length can become a really important marker of social belonging and differentiation. Philosophically, it highlights the fact that identity is socially constructed and that shared symbols and practices, they're what create and maintain group boundaries. So, not conforming becomes a very visible sign of not belonging, which can lead to being excluded or punished.
So, social identity theory, it predicts that conformity, it depends on validating our group identity, and that norms can change pretty quickly when social status or group membership changes, often without needing lots of direct interaction. Even our beliefs about what makes us feel like we belong, those can change rapidly, which can make norms pretty unstable.
Exactly. And experiments on social dilemmas have shown that even subtle cues that remind people of their group identity, well, that can increase cooperation significantly. And while communication within groups also boosts cooperation, there's still debate about whether that's just because of increased group cohesion or because it helps people share information and build trust, like Bikieri and Levon point out. And it's interesting that, sometimes you see cooperative outcomes even in artificial lab settings where there's no explicit group identity, especially when people don't expect to interact in the future. But social identity seems to have a stronger effect when you divide people into separate groups, when you create that us versus them dynamic.
But social identity theory, it's not without its philosophical limitations, is it? Like, what happens when we belong to multiple groups, and those groups have conflicting norms?
That's a big challenge for this theory. I mean, we all belong to multiple groups based on nationality, our job, our hobbies, and so on. And each of those identities might come with its own set of norms. And sometimes those norms clash. Social identity theory doesn't fully explain how we handle those situations where we're being pulled in different directions by different groups. And while it's good at explaining those rapid changes in identity-related norms, like fashion, it doesn't really tell us why some norms are more likely to change quickly than others. Like, why do dress codes change faster than, say, codes of honor within a group? So while social identity theory offers some valuable insights, it doesn't provide a complete philosophical account of social norms.
Okay, let's move on to those early cost-benefit models of norm compliance, the ones that are based on rational choice theory. What's the main philosophical assumption there?
Well, the basic idea behind these models is that people are rational. They're trying to get the most benefit for themselves. So, conformity to social norms, it's seen as a strategic choice, driven by the costs and benefits of complying or not complying. The threat of sanctions, whether it's official legal penalties or just social disapproval, those act as costs. And the potential rewards, like social approval or material benefits, those are the benefits. So complying is the strategy that gets you the most payoff. Thinkers like Romitveit, Thibault, and Kelly, Axelrod, Coleman, they all contributed to this perspective, defining norms mostly in terms of those observable patterns of behavior that are maintained by these external incentives.
So from this perspective, if you see a consistent pattern of behavior and there's punishment for deviating, that's basically what defines a social norm. Sanctions are the key.
That's the main point, yeah. Axelrod, for example, he said, a norm is basically a behavior that happens regularly and there's punishment for breaking it. And Coleman, he saw norm as, at its core, a set of sanctions designed to steer people's actions. But some philosophers, like Diamond and Hobel, they've pointed out that not all social norms have those clear, observable sanctions.
And even when you do have sanctions, there's this philosophical problem of, like, who actually imposes those sanctions? It's a second-order public goods problem. Like, who bears the cost of punishing someone if there's no guarantee that other people will do the same? And Axelrod's idea of metanorms, it seems like it's just kicking the can down the road. What's the philosophical challenge here?
The problem is that punishing someone, it can cost the person who does it, right? It takes time, effort, and there's a risk of retaliation. So If everyone's just acting in their own self-interest, there's no real reason why anyone would bother to punish a norm violator unless they personally benefit. And the idea of metanorms, norms that punish people who don't punish others, well, it doesn't really solve the problem. It just raises the question of who's going to enforce the metanorm, and that can go on forever. So it suggests that maybe external sanctions alone can't explain why all social norms are maintained.
And another thing, for a sanction to actually work, the person being sanctioned has to recognize it as a sanction. And in repeated interactions, like in that prisoner's dilemma game, it can be really hard to tell the difference between an action that's meant as a punishment and an action that's just part of the game, just by looking at behavior. What does this mean from a philosophical point of view?
It means that just looking at behavior isn't enough to define norms and sanctions. If the meaning of an action as a punishment isn't clear, then it's not going to be effective at deterring people from violating norms. It highlights how important shared understanding and interpretation are for social norms to work, something that those purely behavioral cost-benefit models often miss.
And we often see people following norms even when they're totally anonymous, in situations where there's basically no chance of being punished. So it seems like fear of punishment isn't the only reason people comply. What other explanations do philosophers offer for this kind of spontaneous compliance?
One of the main alternatives is the idea of internalization, where, like we talked about with Parsons, norms become part of our own internal motivation. So that feeling of guilt or shame we get when we think about doing something wrong, that acts as a kind of internal punishment. But as we also discussed, Parsons' view of internalization, that it's this deep, unchanging thing, it has its problems.
In Coleman, he tried to fit internalization into rational choice theory by saying that it's good for the group if individuals internalize norms. But this still runs into similar philosophical objections to Parsons' theory, right?
Yeah.
Especially when we look at how fast norms can change and that weak correlation between what people say they believe and how they actually act. Like there are studies on the kids' beliefs about honesty, and they show a surprisingly weak link to whether those kids actually act honestly later on.
That's right. And that disconnect between those deep beliefs and actual behavior, well, it poses a big problem for theories that say it's all about internalized values or those rational calculations based on those values.
But Bikiri, she offers a different view, more cognitive one. She focuses on how norms develop in those tight-knit groups with repeated interactions where people learn to cooperate and then, well, they kind of keep following those cooperative norms as a default. What's the philosophical appeal of this perspective?
What's appealing about Bikiri's view is that it gives us a more nuanced understanding of how norms can become internalized without needing this.